The economics of owning a freight railroad. Hook. You are not buying a train. You are buying tens of thousands of miles of steel, yards, terminals, locomotives, freight cars, dispatch systems, access rights, and the responsibility to make all of those pieces behave like one business. That distinction changes everything. A locomotive by itself is equipment. A mile of track by itself is infrastructure. A yard by itself is a place where rail cars can sit. None of those assets explains the economics of a major freight railroad. The value appears when they become a network. Union Pacific ended 2025 with 32,889 route miles. CSX operated roughly 20,000 route miles. Norfolk Southern operated roughly 19,100. And even those figures understate the physical system an owner has to manage. CSX, for example, reported 35,518 total track miles once additional mainline track, yard track, sidings, and turnouts were counted. So if you were evaluating a railroad as a potential owner, the first mistake would be asking, how much money does one train make? A train is only one moving piece inside a much larger machine. The better question is this: how do you earn an acceptable return on a network this enormous when the network only creates value if expensive assets keep moving through it efficiently, safely, and reliably? Because that is the strange thing about owning a railroad. Its scale is the moat. Its scale is also the burden. 1. What you actually own. Start with the map, but do not assume every line on that map represents the same kind of ownership. At the end of 2025, Union Pacific operated 32,889 route miles. It owned 26,294 of those route miles and operated the rest through trackage rights or leases. Norfolk Southern shows the same structure from another angle. Its roughly 19,100 route mile system included 14,594 owned route miles and another 4,525 route miles operated under leases, contracts, or trackage rights. That matters because the word railroad can make the business sound like one giant piece of real estate. In practice, the operating network is a combination of owned infrastructure and rights to use infrastructure in ways that create a connected system. From an owner's perspective, that distinction is important. You are not simply buying miles. You are buying the ability to connect origins and destinations across a network. Then there is another distinction. Route miles are not total track miles. CSX operated approximately 20,000 route miles at the end of 2025, but reported 35,518 total track miles once additional mainline track, yard track, sidings, and turnouts were included. That gap tells you something fundamental about railroad ownership. The map shows reach. The physical plant has to provide reach plus operating capacity. A route can exist on paper as a line between 2 points, but the railroad still needs places where trains can pass, enter yards, leave yards, be reorganized, and continue moving through the system. The exact value of any individual piece varies, but the owner has to think about how those pieces work together. This is why cost per route mile can be a misleading mental shortcut. Two railroads could have the same route mileage and very different economics because mileage alone does not tell you how traffic flows through the network, how much additional track supports those routes, or where those routes connect. The same principle applies to owned miles versus access rights. A mile that you own and a mile that you can operate over may both contribute to network reach, but they are not the same asset relationship. What matters commercially is whether the total system creates useful connections for freight movements. That is the first owner-level insight. The network is more important than the inventory list. You can count locomotives. You can count rail cars. You can count route miles. You can count track miles. But the business is not the sum of those counts. The business is the connected movement those assets make possible. And that is why the scale can be difficult to comprehend. Union Pacific's 32,889 route miles are not valuable merely because the number is large. The value comes from those miles functioning as a Western U.S. freight network. CSX's roughly 20,000 route miles matter because they form an Eastern network. Norfolk Southern's roughly 19,100 route miles matter for the same reason. A prospective owner, therefore, has to stop thinking like someone buying equipment and start thinking like someone buying a system. If one section of that system is underused, its value depends on what it contributes to the whole. If another section becomes heavily constrained, that constraint can affect the usefulness of assets elsewhere. The network forces you to evaluate every component in context. So before a single dollar of revenue enters the discussion, railroad ownership already has a defining characteristic. You own a large amount of fixed infrastructure whose economic value depends on coordination. And once you understand that, the next question becomes obvious. How does this enormous fixed system actually get paid? #2. How the railroad gets paid. Union Pacific reported $24.510 billion in operating revenue for 2025. Of that, $23.220 billion came from freight revenue. CSX reported $14.1 billion of revenue in 2025. Those figures immediately tell you that a major U.S. freight railroad can support a very large top line. But revenue alone does not explain the business model. The owner is not selling trains. The owner is selling transportation across a network. That distinction sounds small, but economically, it is everything. A train is the operating unit people see. The customer cares about moving freight from one place to another. The railroad, therefore, earns revenue because the network connects a shipper's origin with a destination that matters to that shipper. This is why two trains that look similar can represent very different economics. Their physical appearance does not tell you the commercial value of the freight they are moving, the distance involved, the network resources required, or what alternatives the customer has. The approved research does not give us one universal revenue per car formula, and pretending there is one would oversimplify the business. Instead, think about the unit economics at a higher level. The railroad has a huge fixed network. Every paying movement uses some part of that network. The owner wants enough revenue-producing traffic moving across the system to justify the capital tied up in the infrastructure and equipment. That means network utilization matters enormously. A line on the map has economic purpose when it supports revenue-generating movement. A terminal has economic purpose when it helps that movement continue. Equipment has economic purpose when it participates in that movement rather than remaining idle. This is where scale becomes attractive. Once a useful network exists, additional freight can potentially use infrastructure that is already in place. The owner does not have to rebuild the entire network for every shipment, but that does not make added volume free. More traffic still has to fit through the operating system, and the system still has to be maintained. The cross-border numbers help show just how economically significant those network connections can become. In 2025, rail moved about $184.5 billion of U.S. freight with Canada and Mexico by value. Roughly $89.7 billion was with Canada and about $94.7 billion was with Mexico. That does not mean all U.S. freight rail economics revolve around cross-border trade. It does show how the rail network participates in a larger North American freight system. From an owner's perspective, the important word is connection. A route that connects valuable freight flows can contribute to revenue. A network that connects many such flows can support billions of dollars in annual business. The economic question is therefore not simply how many miles you own, but how effectively those miles support paying traffic. This also explains why the railroad's revenue model cannot be separated from operations. Suppose you have a network capable of producing billions of dollars in revenue, but freight moves slowly through it. The top line may still look enormous, yet the owner may need more time and more asset commitment to handle the same work. Now reverse the thought experiment. If the same network can move freight more fluidly, the owner may get more productive use from assets already committed to the system. That is why railroad unit economics are inseparable from network economics. You cannot evaluate the revenue side without eventually asking how much physical system is required to produce it. And this is where the size of the numbers becomes less comfortable. $24.5 billion of operating revenue sounds enormous. $14.1 billion of revenue sounds enormous. Then you look at the capital spending required to keep a major freight network useful. And suddenly the business begins to look very different. 3. The bill for keeping steel alive. Union Pacific's 2025 capital program was approximately $3.5 billion. CSX invested about $2.9 billion in capital expenditures during 2025. Roughly $2.239 billion of that went to infrastructure. These are the numbers that separate railroad ownership from the fantasy of owning a giant passive toll road. A freight railroad is not an asset you buy once and then simply collect from. It is a physical network that has to remain commercially useful while it is being used, and the owner has to keep committing capital to that network. Be careful here. Capital expenditures are not the same thing as operating expenses, and not every capital dollar serves the same purpose. Some spending may support existing infrastructure. Some may improve capability or capacity. Some may support equipment or technology. So it would be wrong to take total capital expenditures and call the entire amount maintenance. But from an ownership perspective, the broader lesson is clear. The business requires recurring capital at a scale measured in billions of dollars for the largest operators. That changes how you should interpret revenue. Union Pacific generated $24.510 billion of operating revenue in 2025 and had a capital program of approximately $3.5 billion. CSX generated $14.1 billion of revenue and invested about $2.9 billion in capital expenditures. You should not mechanically subtract one number from the other and call the result profit. They are different accounting concepts, but placing them next to each other is still useful because it reveals how much capital intensity sits behind the revenue machine. Imagine an owner looking at a business with $14.1 billion of revenue. In many industries, that number might make the physical asset base feel secondary. In rail, the opposite is true. The physical network is precisely what makes the revenue possible, and a large share of annual investment can flow straight back into that system. This is the core trade-off. The network is difficult to reproduce because it is enormous. The network is expensive to own because it is enormous. The same characteristic creates both the moat and the obligation. This is also why a railroad can never be evaluated purely by asking whether the company is growing revenue. An owner has to ask a second question. What does it take to sustain the productive capacity that generates that revenue? If a business produces more revenue only by demanding disproportionate additions to the capital base, that growth may look less attractive than the top line suggests. If the network can produce more useful output from assets already in place, the economics may improve without the same degree of physical expansion. That is the owner's obsession. Not just growth, but productivity of capital. The approved research does not give us one universal maintenance number for the entire U.S. rail industry, so we should not invent one. What we can say is that two of the largest freight rail systems demonstrate recurring capital commitments measured in billions of dollars. For Union Pacific, roughly $3.5 billion in 2025. For CSX, roughly $2.9 billion. And CSX reports that about $2.239 billion of its 2025 capital expenditures went to infrastructure. That is enough to make the ownership problem concrete. The network has to keep earning while capital keeps flowing back into it. So the question becomes, how do you make that enormous capital base work harder? This is where operating metrics stop looking like obscure railroad statistics and start looking like financial variables. 4. The network is the product. CSX reported 3 numbers for 2025 that are useful for understanding railroad economics. Train velocity of 18.4 miles per hour, average dwell of 10.3 hours, and 196.5 billion revenue ton miles. At first glance, these seem like operations department statistics. From an owner's perspective, they tell you something more important: how the network is using time. And time is critical when you own expensive assets that only create transportation value when freight progresses through the system. Take dwell. The approved figure is 10.3 hours for CSX in 2025. The point is not that there is some magical dwell number every railroad should target. Different networks and operating conditions are different. The point is that dwell is measured because time inside the network matters. When equipment spends time waiting in the system, that time is part of the operating cycle. Now take train velocity. CSX reported 18.4 miles per hour in 2025. Again, this is not a universal benchmark we should apply to every railroad. It is an example of how a major railroad measures the speed at which trains move across its network. Why should an owner care? Because the same asset can produce different amounts of useful work depending on how long the operating cycle takes. This is the simplest way to understand network productivity. Imagine 2 identical asset bases, same amount of track, same broad equipment commitment, same basic customer demand. If one system requires substantially more time to move equivalent freight through the network, that difference can affect how much productive output the capital base can support. We do not need to invent a dollar figure to see the economic logic. Assets tied up for longer periods cannot simultaneously be somewhere else doing additional work. That is why a railroad owner cares about movement, waiting, and throughput as economic concepts rather than merely operational details. Revenue ton miles provide another scale reference. CSX reported 196.5 billion revenue ton miles in 2025. That number combines freight weight and distance into a measure of transportation work. It reinforces the idea that this business is fundamentally about moving enormous amounts of freight across enormous distances using a fixed network. Now connect the 3 concepts. Revenue ton miles tell you how much transportation work is being performed. Velocity tells you something about how trains move through the system. Dwell tells you something about time spent in terminals. Together, they help explain why railroad economics are so sensitive to flow. The network is not just infrastructure waiting for trains to appear. It is a constrained operating system. If one part of that operating system becomes slower, the effects can extend beyond that location because trains, cars, and schedules are connected across the network. This is not a claim that every delay creates a specific dollar loss. The approved research does not provide that calculation. It is the basic operating logic of a connected network. That logic also explains why simply adding more assets is not always the first or best answer. If a system is losing productive time inside the network, adding more equipment can increase the capital committed without necessarily fixing the underlying flow problem. The owner, therefore, has 2 broad levers. One is capacity, invest more capital. The other is productivity, get more useful movement from the capital already committed. In reality, large railroads use combinations of both. But the economic distinction is crucial. Every additional dollar of capital has to earn its place in the system. Every improvement in network productivity can potentially make the existing capital base more useful. This is why the railroad can look like a simple transportation company from the outside and a giant optimization problem from the inside. The locomotives are visible. The optimization is not. And this is also where the temptation to push efficiency harder becomes powerful. If faster cycles and higher utilization can improve the productivity of expensive assets, why not simply make trains longer, schedules tighter, and the entire system leaner? Because efficiency has physical limits. 5. Efficiency has a breaking point. The basic economic argument for a longer train is easy to understand. If one train can move more freight, some resources associated with operating a train may be spread across more cars or more tonnage. That is the attraction. But longer trains also change the operating problem. The Federal Railroad Administration has warned that longer freight trains involve stronger and more complex in-train forces. The agency has also identified operational concerns involving braking, communications, and blocked crossings. The careful wording matters. This does not mean every long train is unsafe. It does not mean train length by itself determines accident risk. And it does not give us license to attach an invented cost penalty to every additional car. What the FRA guidance does establish is that train length changes operating complexity. For an owner, that is enough to create a real economic trade-off. Efficiency improvements are valuable only if they remain compatible with safe, reliable operations. A decision can look efficient in one narrow metric and still create complications elsewhere in the operating system. Think about the owner's objective. You do not actually want the longest train possible. You do not actually want the lowest dwell number possible at any cost. You do not actually want the highest asset utilization possible if the network becomes unstable. You want the combination that produces the strongest sustainable economics for the system while respecting safety and service constraints. That is a more difficult problem than maximizing one metric. It is also why debates around railroad operating models can become so polarized. One side can point to efficiency. Another can point to resilience or service. The saved research explicitly treats the broader precision-scheduled railroading debate as disputed, so this script should not pretend there is one universally proven answer. The useful owner-level lesson is narrower and stronger. A railroad is a network, so local efficiency gains have to be judged by what they do to the whole network. If a change lets the system move more useful freight with the same capital while maintaining safe and reliable operations, that can be economically attractive. If a change improves one metric but creates enough operating friction elsewhere, the system-level result can be less attractive. The challenge is measurement. Railroads can measure train velocity, they can measure dwell, they can measure revenue ton miles. Regulators can examine service and safety issues, but no single number captures the entire economic health of the network. That is why the owner has to think in systems. The same capital intensity that makes efficiency so valuable also makes over-optimization risky. And there is another constraint beyond physics and operations. Even if you own the tracks, locomotives, yards, and access rights, you do not own the rule book. Chapter 6. You own the railroad, not the rules. The Surface Transportation Board gives us a useful starting point for understanding how regulation intersects with railroad economics. For 2024, the Class 1 revenue threshold was approximately $1.075 billion in annual operating revenue under the board's deflator methodology. That threshold alone tells you the category is about very large carriers. But the more interesting concept for an owner is revenue adequacy. The STB evaluates revenue adequacy by comparing a railroad's return on net investment with the rail industry's after-tax cost of capital for the year. That is a very specific regulatory economic framework. It should not be simplified into the railroad is profitable or the railroad is allowed to earn this much. The concept is more revealing than that. It acknowledges a basic reality of railroad ownership. These are capital-intensive networks, and the ability to earn returns on that capital matters. If a railroad cannot earn enough to justify continued investment, the long-term economics of the network become difficult. But the regulatory system is not concerned only with the owner's return. Service and competitive access matter too. That is where reciprocal switching becomes relevant. In 2024, the STB adopted a rule creating a path for certain customers served by only one Class I carrier to petition for access to another line-haul carrier when specified service standards are not met. Then, in 2026, the board proposed changes to part of the reciprocal switching framework. Those two developments have to remain separate in the narration. The 2024 action was an adopted rule. The 2026 action was a proposal. The larger economic point is that a railroad owner does not have unlimited freedom simply because the company controls infrastructure. The network sits inside a regulatory framework where returns, service performance, and access can become connected questions. This is especially important because freight rail competition is not uniform. It would be inaccurate to describe the entire industry as one simple monopoly. Customers can face different alternatives depending on location, route, and available transportation options. The approved research therefore treats captive shipper and competition claims carefully, rather than turning them into a slogan. From the owner's perspective, that uncertainty matters because the strategic value of a route can depend partly on how commercially important that connection is to customers. From the regulator's perspective, the same dependence can create concern about service and access. So the owner operates inside a tension. The railroad needs enough economic return to support an enormous capital base. Customers need service that makes the network useful. Regulators have an interest in how those two sides interact. This is why the STB's revenue adequacy framework is such an interesting concept for the channel. Most businesses do not have a federal regulator explicitly comparing return on net investment with an industry cost of capital as part of a recurring regulatory framework. Rail does. That does not tell you whether a specific railroad is a good investment. It does reveal how central capital returns are to the public policy around the industry. And that brings us to the feature that makes those returns possible in the first place. A major freight network is extraordinarily hard to reproduce. 7. The moat you cannot rebuild. Suppose you decided that freight rail looks attractive and you wanted to create a new competitor at Class I scale. The obvious image is locomotives. But locomotives are not the core problem. The core problem is the network. Union Pacific operated 32,889 route miles at the end of 2025. CSX operated roughly 20,000. Norfolk Southern operated roughly 19,100. Those route miles matter because they are connected into operating systems that already serve established freight flows. A new entrant does not recreate that commercial position simply by owning an equal number of miles somewhere else. That is the most important way to think about the railroad moat. The scarce asset is not steel rail by itself. The scarce asset is a connected network in useful places. And the fact that large railroads operate portions of their systems through trackage rights, leases, and contracts reinforces the point. Economic reach comes from the network you can operate, not only from land you own outright. This is why route geography matters more than an abstract mileage count. Imagine 1,000 miles of track that connect major freight origins and destinations versus 1,000 miles that do not. The physical amount of track could be identical. The economic usefulness could be completely different. We do not need a precise valuation formula to understand why. Customers pay for movement between places that matter to them. The network is valuable when it provides those movements. This creates a barrier that is much deeper than equipment cost. Even if a new entrant could acquire locomotives and freight cars, it would still need a useful operating network. The approved research plan identifies rights-of-way, connectivity, terminals, and geography as central barriers. But because the saved claims do not contain a universal dollar estimate for building a new network, the script should resist dramatic, unsupported construction cost claims. The stronger point is structural. Existing networks already exist. They already connect markets. They already operate at continental scale. And they already require billions of dollars of recurring capital to sustain. That last point is essential because it keeps the Moat story from turning into a fantasy of effortless monopoly profit. The network may be difficult to replicate, but the owner cannot simply sit back. Union Pacific's 2025 capital program was about $3.5 billion. CSX's capital expenditures were about $2.9 billion. The asset is scarce, but scarcity does not eliminate reinvestment. In fact, the harder the network is to recreate, the more important it becomes to preserve the usefulness of the network you already have. That creates one of the most unusual economic profiles in American business. You own an asset with a powerful structural moat. You also own an asset that continually asks for capital. And the return depends on keeping the entire system productive enough to justify both facts at once. #8. What the owner is really buying. Now put the pieces together. Union Pacific reported $24.510 billion in operating revenue for 2025. CSX reported $14.1 billion of revenue. Those numbers show the commercial scale that a major freight network can support. Then look at the capital side. Union Pacific's 2025 capital program was approximately $3.5 billion. CSX invested about $2.9 billion in capital expenditures, including roughly $2.239 billion in infrastructure. Now look at the operating side. CSX reported 18.4 miles per hour of train velocity, 10.3 hours of dwell, and 196.5 billion revenue ton miles. Those metrics show why the owner cannot evaluate the railroad as a static real estate portfolio. The network is valuable because it performs transportation work, and the productivity of the operating cycle matters. Then look at regulation. The Surface Transportation Board evaluates revenue adequacy by comparing return on net investment with the industry's after-tax cost of capital. That tells you how directly capital returns are embedded in the economics and policy of freight rail. Then look at physical operating constraints. The Federal Railroad Administration warns that longer trains bring stronger and more complex in-train forces and can create operational issues involving braking, communications, and blocked crossings. That tells you why efficiency cannot be reduced to bigger is always better. Finally, look at the network itself. Union Pacific's 32,889 route miles, CSX's roughly 20,000. Norfolk Southern's roughly 19,100. Those networks are difficult to reproduce because their value comes from connected geography, not simply from owning steel. This is what a freight railroad owner is really buying: a revenue machine that requires constant reinvestment, a physical moat that demands constant operation, a network where time becomes an economic variable. A business where efficiency is valuable but cannot be separated from safety and reliability. And an asset whose returns exist inside a regulatory framework because the network matters to customers and the broader freight system. That is why the business can be both attractive and unforgiving. The attractive part is scale. Once a useful network exists, it can support enormous volumes of transportation activity and billions of dollars of revenue. The unforgiving part is also scale. The network is too large, too capital-intensive, and too interconnected to manage casually. A small operating problem can matter because assets and routes depend on one another. A capital decision can matter for years because the infrastructure base is so large. A regulatory change can matter because access and service are part of the economic relationship between railroad and customer. So the owner's objective is not simply to run more trains. It is not simply to cut costs. It is not simply to raise prices. It is to produce enough useful transportation output from an enormous fixed system that the entire network earns a return worth the capital tied up in it. That is the real unit of analysis, not the locomotive, not the freight car, not even the train, the network. And that may be the best way to understand why freight rail looks so strange from an ownership perspective. The train is the thing everyone sees. The network is the thing you are actually buying.